in terms of wild turkeys. Out of all these effects, can you think of any positive ones tied to supplemental feeding corn?
Not off the top of my head.
I think our silence is an answer in itself.
Welcome to the Speak the Language podcast presented by Onyx Hunt. Happy that you're here for another episode. There's a few things I need to cover before we get into today's particular subject because, quite frankly, the subject of today is a tricky one. So, first and foremost, we put these episodes out there to be informative. We stumbled upon this subject and we knew we wanted to cover it, but we knew there's no way in the world we could do it justice if it was just Jordan and myself sitting in a room speculating on something that is as important and potentially as controversial as this. So we brought in folks that are scientists, that are wildlife biologists, that know what they're talking about, and so we can get a real balanced science-based perspective. So these guys are folks that you've heard on here before. You've heard them on here very recently. We have Dr. Marcus Lashley and Dr. Will Gulsby of the Wild Turkey Science podcast. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. It's not the most fun of conversations, but it is a very informative one. I think it's going to be one that is thought-provoking. So I'm going to get straight into it. Hope you enjoy the show.
So, Jordan, I know you and I have talked about this prior to. Mm-hmm. We wanted to bring this, I guess, to give the opportunity to these two gentlemen that are sitting with us who are obviously far more knowledgeable, Dr. Lashley, Dr. Gulsby. One of the things that we'd felt like it's been talked about, like we've heard questions pop up about it, but not a lot. But I thought it was a question that needed to be asked more.
It's something that's been on my mind a good bit. Me and you've talked about it.
Yeah.
It's like we don't have any data to talk about or have any knowledge other than just what we see.
Basically, to go straight at it, in recent years, I'll put it like that, there's been a lot of changes in baiting laws, particularly with whitetails. Mm-hmm. I remember when I was a kid, baiting of any kind was a no-no. I mean, that was like you'd hear about, man, the guy down the road got busted for putting out corn, and it was like a big taboo thing. Mm-hmm. Now, fast forward through all the changes that have made, if you have, in Mississippi, talking about my home state, yep, if you have corn or any other kind of feed in a spin cast feeder or a covered trough, you can sit on top of that thing and shoot a deer if you want to. But we're not talking about deer. We're talking about wild turkeys. Basically, we're noticing, like, especially on private ground, obviously, there's corn feeders that were never there before. There's corn feeders that are running all throughout the year, including the spring. And I would have to think, and here's where I'll kick it over to you, that would have to have some impact or implications on wild turkeys and how we hunt them.
And I would add to that too, that one of the things that I feel like we hear all the time, from other scientists and hunters and folks that we talk to, is that how many people are killing turkeys with corn in their crop that are hunting properties where they know there's no corn. Even in the middle of
every spring
public track.
Every spring.
I have killed a couple on public land that there shouldn't be any feed anywhere near them. Mm-hmm. And they, if it's a little bit later up in the morning, that's pretty common to have them.
Yeah, I killed a turkey second to the last day of season last year, and I know for a fact that there was on the property I was hunting. Obviously, I can't speak to the bordering ones.
That's 1,400 acres.
Yeah, there was not a feeder or feed on the ground anywhere on that thing, crop full. And it honestly became a little dejecting, because it's not the first time that's happened to me or people that I know. And that's, again, it's like you start to think, like, this has to have an impact.
Yeah.
And we know this is a loaded topic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
this one is a topic that, I don't know, when I've talked to people about it, it's like instant defense. People just get really upset about it, and we got prepared for this, and we're thinking about trying to address some of the data that we do have on various species. And I constantly think about the interactions that I've had, and it's not, it's legal.
Yeah.
For you to do it. We're not trying to cast any blame on anybody. Like, this isn't about making people feel bad or whatever. This is just, we need to understand the implications of things we do, and sometimes we're doing things and they have implications that people aren't aware of. But in my experience, I have talked to quite a few people about this, and it really provokes this defensive posture with somebody that is engaged in practices like that. So it's certainly one of those issues that I don't hear many people talk about it because it's so hard to talk about. It's like you're blaming each other over it, and this is I am not hunter against hunter here.
No.
Like we all need to come together, and that's the only way we really are going to make movements to do things right. And we got a lot of concern with turkeys, so I think this is an important conversation to have, and that's why we're here, because we want to, just cover the data that we have.
Right. Yeah, education.
Yeah.
I mean, education's key.
That's our job.
Yeah.
I mean, as wildlife scientists and researchers, we're not here to make value judgments or to shame people. It's to give you the information on, Marcus said it well, so that any practice that you're implementing, according to the best available data that we have, that you go into it with both eyes open, understanding the pros and cons of it.
Yeah. When you're within your legal right to do whatever's legal.
And I'm glad that you said that, because it is important to say, I know guys that go into a, quote, supplemental feeding program, and their intentions are 100% because they think that's better for their deer herd, or some of them think this is better for my turkeys, or this is what I need to do to get turkeys, and there's not any sort of malintent.
Well, I think most people are in that boat. I mean,
right.
Most people are trying to help. They're trying to make their resource better, more abundant,
and there are
healthier.
A lot of folks out there that don't know what else they can do. Pouring out some feed is a lot simpler than trying to figure out how to identify 10 plants that comprise quality brood rearing habitat, for example. Those things are feeding is more within reach of a person, is assuming that they have the funds to do it, right? It's not something that they have to be very knowledgeable about to execute.
Right.
So y'all have some data.
Yeah, so I've been really interested and concerned, but Will and I both, especially as part of the new podcast, we're constantly digging through the literature, and I'm learning stuff, and we know that we should be concerned about turkeys.
Right.
And we're trying to figure out what are the concerns, and do we have enough data to be concerned? Is it a cause? Is it part of the, and I think we have enough information that it needs to be.
Well, I'm ready to dive off in this thing and learn some things. I'm very curious on what y'all's, what you've been studying and what's came out of it. What's your assumption?
Teasing y'all.
Whatever y'all are willing to share about the subject of baiting and how that impacts wild turkeys, whatever y'all are willing to share with us today, we are all ears.
Yeah.
And if it makes you mad, direct all emails to Marcus. Lashley.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, to start with, what most people think about, I'm one of these people that initially, when I was thinking about the implications of, some of these feeding practices, is that it's going to influence the harvest rate of turkeys.
Mm-hmm.
And that is like the outer layer of the onion.
Mm-hmm.
It's the obvious thing that most people think about. I don't think we have uncovered much data on that, other than we know anecdotally that this is an argument amongst hunters all the time about who's getting too close to their feeders or whatever, and people argue over that, but I don't think we have very good data on that particular thing. But that's just the outer layer, and we do have some good data on the inner layers when we start drilling in. Some of it's striking.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the studies that I was a part of it coincided with the change in feeding laws in Mississippi, because as part of that process, they had, I don't know, I'm not very good with the legislating part, but part of that law had assigned money for research to understand the implications of that decision.
Gotcha.
So it funded multiple projects through Mississippi State. I was a professor there at the time, and then moved on to Florida before the project was completed. Mm-hmm. But it was part of some of the initial designs and oversaw one of the graduate students involved in it. But one thing that was really striking to me is we did experiments where we were tracking the use of feeders, and we set them up. We tried to mimic what people did in the state, just spin cast, and we actually did track a lot of feeders that were on people's properties, and then we also tracked feeders that we implemented in an experimental design where we could do some really interesting work. And the thing that was striking to me immediately out of the gate is, what do you think the number one consumer of the feeder was?
If I had to guess,
raccoons.
That's what I was going to be my guess.
Even more than deer?
I would say time spent there, yes.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Is that right?
So in our study, about 75% of the use was not deer.
Not 75% of the use was not deer.
Yeah. So that was immediately striking to me, and raccoon was the number one.
Wow.
Because it seems like just watching cameras on feeders and stuff, like a raccoon walks up there, he gonna chill for the rest of the night.
Yeah. I mean, I'm seeing them. They're showing us videos of the chubby raccoons. You know, they can't even crawl in their hole when they get done with it. Or, you know, those things are popping out online. But that was one thing that initially was pretty striking to me. Mm-hmm. And when you go through the literature on feeding studies where they're actually tracking the use by different things, they are almost always in their range, you know, in the range of raccoons. Mm-hmm. They're almost always the number one user.
Mm-hmm. So
I know it's not good for a raccoon to be around there all the time. So
where my mind goes immediately is, so what you say, again, we live in a different, we can't think of things in the way that y'all do because y'all are scientists.
Well, that's true, but I appreciate it.
Well, what I'm thinking, here's where my mind goes, is one of the biggest things you see right now in the turkey space, which you see circling on social media, is this kind of self-perpetuated push for people to trap and nest predators, and what you end up seeing is usually a raccoon caught in a trap, and trap raccoons, all well and good. And so where my mind goes, like, so you're telling me that we may just have a kind of a self-repeating cycle going on. We're trapping them, but we're also feeding them, so we're just kind of keeping the thing going. That's where my head goes.
Oh, you actually had a pretty good thought.
That's pretty reasonable. That's a pretty reasonable thought.
And some people even like keeping corn out to concentrate the raccoons to trap them.
I've actually seen that response a few times where people were like, well, we got to increase trapping. The thought is not, maybe we need to be worried about, you know, the feeding aspect. Like, that's off the table, I guess. We got to increase trapping. The other interesting thing, when we talked to you guys about doing this and knowing that this is a sensitive subject, we wanted to really give it due diligence, and we've given it a really thorough look in the literature, and that got us looking at this from a global standpoint.
Okay.
And another thing that was pretty striking right along those same lines is there was a European study. They characterized the use based on, you know, what the users, like, into groups, and they had one group that was nest predators. Would you like to take a guess on what proportion of the feeder use was by nest predators? That's not in the range.
Y'all didn't know y'all were getting quizzed today.
Sure, I mean, it's got to be over 50%.
So I was going to say 70.
It's 80%.
80% of the entire use is under the qualification of nest predator,
which I think is that predate and nest on their game birds that nest very similarly to our game bird that we're talking about.
And I think it's remarkable, too, Marcus, how consistent that is with the 75% that y'all found in the study that you were involved in Mississippi. You go all the way across the Atlantic Ocean, and it's almost the same exact number over there.
Well, and I don't remember the specific numbers, but it's very similar pattern on multiple other studies from the other places in the United States. We have very consistent data on that. The majority of it's not going to the target animal, which is usually whitetails for us.
Right.
Majority of it is not going to that animal, and a large portion of it is, in many cases, when they group them that way, it's to nest predators.
Yeah.
You ain't kidding about layers. There's a lot of layers in this.
Well,
so
we were only on the second one.
Well, the first thing that comes to my mind when we talk about this. So, and if you don't know, that's fine. But from a nest predator type animal, and you're supplementing feeding, and that's attracting those, are you bringing those nest predators from a different home range to that area? I mean, are you just feeding what you have right there in their normal area? Are they actually finding that and staying there?
That's a great question.
Then we don't really know.
Okay, that's fine.
We've got some other stuff that's related to that, but I'm surprised your mind went there first, because I feel like where mine first goes is thinking about, is this turning into supplemental feeding of predators, thereby increasing their survival rates and their reproductive output? And we don't have data on that either.
Yeah, we weren't able to find how it affects reproduction of raccoons. That it may exist, and if somebody out there is listening and you know of that data set, send it to us, because we will cover it.
Right. Well, I spun off of what Lake was talking about, and I was like, in my mind, I was like, if you're attracting more nest predator type animals to this area, are you, and the whole trapping, feeding cycle, are you just steadily bringing in new animals because you're feeding, and that way?
Well, you could. So there's multiple layers even to that.
Yeah.
So we have a term that we kind of throw out. You probably don't hear it very commonly, and I don't even among biologists, but the relative density. Right. So you think about around that feeder, and we're concentrating use of the animals that are there. Maybe there's something, we don't have the data on it, but you could have this attraction of new animals to that, which then increases density. So your effective density is around the feeder is far higher, because you've concentrated use of the number of individuals in a smaller area, and you potentially attract new ones. Don't have data on that part. We know about the concentration of the same, the individual raccoons that are using the feeder are obviously concentrating their use around it. Maybe we get more immigrants into it as well. I don't know. And maybe it affects reproduction. Don't know. We don't have hard data on those two things, but we do know that our effective density, or that relative density around that feeder, is artificially increased substantially.
That's interesting.
We don't necessarily know the mechanism why, but we know that it happens. Right. But the closest piece of information that we were able to ascertain that shows kind of a supplemental feeding effect of this practice on a species that you don't want around is with feral pigs. And while we don't have a study saying putting spin feeders out with corn in them increases pig numbers or pig reproduction, we do know that pig reproduction is closely tied to acorns, to mass crops. And corn has essentially the exact same nutritional profile, or close to it, of acorns. So it's reasonable to believe, if there's enough of that out on the landscape, that it could lead to females being in better body condition and being able to reproduce with larger litters and more often.
Yeah.
Now,
so you could actually increase the reproductive rate. We see that with masting. There's some data to suggest the same thing in agricultural landscapes with pigs, but don't know about the feeder, but it's a perfectly reasonable hypothesis based on the data we have.
That is interesting.
So it's possible that we're essentially creating hotspots for these nest predators. Just better places for them to thrive.
Problematic species in general,
And here's where my mind goes with that. Again, going back to these changing in the baiting laws, I know because I'm out there and I'm seeing it on places that I've hunted in the past, or places I've had permission to hunt on. There's feeders where there never were feeders before. It's getting to where it's hard to go on a piece of private ground and there not be some sort of feeder somewhere. It may be one, it may be 5 of them, but it's like, where my mind goes is like, this is starting to happen on a large scale area. It's starting to happen on a state level.
Yeah. I would say that it's very rare that I go on a property that's not covered up with feeders.
And you just look at it from the standpoint of, how many little mom and pop gas stations in rural areas have bags of, pallets of corn, even
everyone
inside the front door, or just out there on the porch, or, they've even got those drive-by corn dispensers, those small grain bins now, where you can buy it. Empty corn bags all up and down the sides of the rural highways.
Yeah.
We don't have good data on how feeding practices have changed post-legalization in certain states, but it stands to reason from all these observations that they've increased somewhat. We don't know the exact extent, but
right. It just from anecdotal data, you just have to be like, it has to have,
right?
Because you're just, again, we're seeing them everywhere,
right?
So, what would you expect to happen if you're a turkey that decides to nest near a feeder?
Well, in my mind, I'm going off kilter here. I'm going to a fishing pond. But in my mind, you get a whole bunch of bass with a very little minnow cover. Then minnows going to get ate up.
Yeah.
Well, I may be putting the cart ahead of the horse here. Does it seem like the turkeys are recognizing that it's a hot spot, or are they still nesting close to feeders?
Don't have the data.
Quit teasing them, Marcus. Just
I don't know enough about how it changes a wild turkey's patterns to know if that changes where they nest according to a feeder location.
Yeah, I have not seen data to look that is assessed where nesting occurs relative to feeders.
Right. So
the closest thing that I'm aware of related to that is with deer. And we've shown that while deer don't shift their home ranges, they do increase the intensity of use of areas around bait piles and feeders within the home range. And it's reasonable to think that if turkeys are regularly using that would be kind of the same thing.
So it's, like you said, they could end up nesting there more frequently because there's a feeder there.
They could.
Yeah.
Or they could avoid it because there's high risk there. Or
we really don't know.
They may just nest randomly across the landscape and relative to them. I don't know what to tell you on that. But think about how many feeders are potentially on the landscape.
Right.
And let's just assume that sometimes they do nest near them. I don't know how they could. There are definitely situations that I've seen where it'd be pretty hard for them not to be nesting near one.
No matter where they go, they're going to be near one.
Yeah. They don't have a choice to be far from it, So that's obviously changes based on where you're at and everything. But we tried to dig into an obvious implication to, well, what if they nest close to it? We have a few good studies on that. They have limitations because we had to use simulated nest. It's incredibly difficult to capture a hen and know where she's going to nest. So it's very difficult to manipulate some in an experimental design with real turkeys and real nests. And to my knowledge, we do not have that data.
Yeah. Okay. And so going into this, the immediate limitations of such a study are that number one, you don't have a predator potentially cueing on seeing that hen, the visual cue,
or any kind of cue,
or smelling
with the hen.
Smelling her, which would maybe help them locate the nest. But on the flip side, you also don't have a hen there to defend the nest.
Yeah, and think about like an aerial egg eater, like a crow. If it sees an egg laying there, it's going to fly down there and eat the egg. But if a hen's sitting on top of it, it's not going to see it.
Right.
So, and then you have the defense. I've posted a few videos like this showing how defensive the hen is of her nest.
Yeah.
She'll run everybody off, and it's pretty impressive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've seen those videos. It is impressive.
Yeah.
And really, Brett Collier recently sent us some videos.
Yeah, so we have an episode we recorded with Brett. It'll probably be right about the same time that this goes live, I assume, where he had a bunch of data. What was that? What subspecies was that?
I can't remember if that was Rios or Easterns.
No, I don't think it. Yeah, I don't remember, but he sent us a bunch of. It was Gould's. It was Gould's.
Was it?
Yeah. He sent us a bunch of pictures of hens sitting on the nest, and there's a bear standing next to it. Like she just sits there, and they just ignore her. It was kind of interesting.
There was another one.
We've had a really good conversation with him about all that, which is going to kind of is going to definitely make people think hard about nest predation just in general, and how we've been thinking about it. It's quite different. But anyway, all that to say, the nesting information that I'm going to share with you has some limitations because of the way we have to do that experiment. It doesn't necessarily represent an actual hen nesting perfectly, but it's concerning.
Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, what we want to look at here are the trends, not the absolute values of these numbers.
Yeah. So on the European study where 80% of the feeder use was by nest predators, in that case they simulated nests near a feeder, and then when it was a control, it wasn't near a feeder. And I don't remember exactly the distances and all that. We'll send you the paper if you want it. All you got to do is ask. But on the control, about 30% of those were predated or scavenged. 30% of them in the control when there's no feeder around. That jumped up to 65%. More than double predation rate on the nests. Which immediately,
when they were located,
if the nest, they're simulating a nest, so they're literally going out and making a little nest like in this case it was for a grouse or a partridge. I can't remember which species, but a ground nesting game bird. In that European study, when they simulated that nest near a feeder, 65% compared to when it wasn't near a feeder, it was 30%.
That's a big difference in
poult production. More than double the nest predation.
Wow.
So again, let's make sure that we're very clear that that's a simulated nest, and having a hen or female associated with that nest changes that dynamic some.
Right.
And we don't have that other data, but that's still concerning.
Yeah, this is a trend indicating that there's either greater predator abundance. There's greater predator abundance in that area around the feeder. Like we said earlier, we don't know exactly what the mechanism is. Right. If it's just that you're drawing them in, or that you're actually making more of them.
Right. But the effective density of the predator is higher, regardless of what the mechanism is.
Right.
There's more risk to predation there because of so much use by predators.
And it's probable reason to believe that if a hen makes a nest close proximity to a feeder, I know not absolute numbers, but trending wise, they're higher probability of getting wiped out.
The risk of that nest being depredated is higher.
Yeah. So we went from 30% to 65%.
Yeah.
That to me makes me pause. Like I'm concerned, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So let's go on and double down on that. There was another study in South Georgia that did a similar thing, and they were simulating turkey nests or quail nests. I can't remember. It was a ground nesting bird again. They did it in a different way than that other study. So in this one, they have a non-fed, so that just means there's no feeder nearby anywhere. And in the non-fed simulated nests, they did it over a gradient. So basically, that means they're going to have a range of predation risk or predation events over that gradient for the non-fed site. That was 30 to 50% of those simulated nests. Again, we got the same issues with that study design as we talked about with the other one.
Right.
But 30 to 50, somewhere between a third and half of those nests get depredated when they're not near a feeder.
That was actually, Marcus, that was success.
Oh, success.
It was 30 to 50% nest success when they were not near a feeder.
Okay. Excuse me.
Gotcha.
Thank you for clarifying that. We took really diligent notes, and they all report them. One of them says the probability of being eaten, and the other one's a probability of success.
Easy to get them mixed up. Yeah.
So don't want to be misleading, so don't let me.
So no feeder.
Yeah, no feeder. We have a 30 to 50% success. So that means the nest made it some length of time that they had predetermined in the study that, they were going to decide if it gets to this time period, that means it's good. So
I'm simulating like a hatch, I would assume.
Yeah.
Or
So I don't know what the day length was that
Right.
they did it, but they had some arbitrary time that they did a priori before there was any known, they were trying to just standardize, basically. So the non-fed, 30 to 50% success. And then in the fed, what they did is they put it in that gradient that I was talking to you about, except it was distance from the feeder.
Okay.
So they've simulated these nests at varying distances from the feeder. They went all the way out to 255 meters. So it's like 300 yards, I think. So simulated nest. They stated in the paper they stopped there because they didn't think there was any reason to go any further. So in the fed, so you remember the range. Let me back up and just make sure you remember the range. On the non-fed, along that gradient, 30 to 50%, it always stayed in between that.
Gotcha.
Those are kind of the lower and upper bound. On the fed, it was below 20% for the entire range, whole thing, all the way up to 255 meters. And remember, they stopped because they didn't think they needed to go farther.
So they don't even know if they'd have gone to 400 yards if it would have been the same thing.
Yeah, we on average for the non-fed, we're on average 40%, and we never got above 20% success for the entire range of what they tested.
Holy smokes!
Oh, this is concerning.
And so
I'm hearing red flags.
So hold up. So we did the math on this, and you convert 255 a circle with a radius of 255 meters to acres, and that adds up to 50 acres. There's a 50-acre patch around that feeder where nest success is affected.
Yeah, and it was half. Now, again, that doesn't necessarily equate to a hen on a nest.
Right.
We're trying to be very clear about the limitations here. But
50 acres
around each feeder.
So just think about that. For you to not, in that scenario, if that is applying to wild turkeys, if they're within that 50-acre radius, they're being negatively affected by that feeder.
Oh, my gosh.
And in most cases, just from what I've seen in places and being management and all that kind of stuff, it's about a feeder about every 100 acres maybe, or not more.
Well, I mean, again, we live in the Southeast. You and I both live in Mississippi. We live, folks, again, I'm not pointing a finger at anybody. We're trying to shed light on something potentially. But how many places where it's like a stack of 40 and 60 acre blocks, and those are all,
Everybody's got their own 40 or 60 or 100.
That little 40 is going to have at least one span.
The average landowner size is, less than 50 acres, I'm pretty sure, isn't it?
Something like that.
So if there's a 40-acre block and there's one spin cast feeder on it, that one feeder could potentially be harming the nest success of that entire 40 acres.
If it responds similarly to what these simulated nests, then yes.
Oh my God.
And for example, with that video that I put out recently with the hen defending her nest.
Yeah.
We don't have that in the simulated. There's not a hen there, right? But a lot of people commented on that as evidence that predators are a problem. And the video I put in there, I don't think this was evident to people. That hen was repeatedly interacting with those nest predators, and then she hatched the nest and then brooded off with them into the sunset. I don't know what happened to them after they left that site, but she successfully nested, even though she's had interactions. Every night.
Yeah,
she's got raccoons and possums in there bothering her, and she was able to ward them off and still nested, which is great job, Mama. That's awesome. So just because you see that on the simulated nest, that may not occur because she's really good at defending it. But then also think about that on the other side when she's
getting messed with more.
Yeah, she might get messed with more, and there's probably more potential that she is unsuccessfully defending her nest. So
I think another important part to think about too, Marcus, is we have no data on poult survival within a certain radius of these feeders either.
Yeah, that's where my mind went.
We couldn't find anything.
So it's like if you have one bad to the bone mama hen that is nested close to a feeder, she gets bothered every night, but somehow she hatches those poults. Well, now she's got poults on the ground in a spot where there's a high density area for predators. So what is that? We all know a poult it's hard for them to grow up anyway. So we're having them born into areas where there's already predators.
Is there any data that y'all know about from? This may not make sense when it comes out of my mouth. That happens a lot.
Been there.
We'll work through it together. It's all right.
We'll get it.
If you're increasing numbers on nest predators, more than likely you're increasing numbers on like squirrels, rabbits, all this kind of stuff too. In return, would that increase your fowls of the air? You see where I'm going with this?
Yeah, well, that's what I was talking about with the poults. Is like, does that mean you're bringing in more bobcats or hawks or, you know what I mean?
Yeah. That's difficult to get at.
Yeah,
you're taking it to the next level of ecology, really, thinking about how all this starts to interact.
Yeah, and that's the kind of stuff. That's the reason I got into ecology right there, because I love the complexity of the system
and how one thing changes so much.
Yes.
So I remember, and I think about it all the time, but I think about it right now. Applied aquatic and terrestrial ecology. One of the first classes I took at Mississippi State, Dr. Robbie Kroger.
I can't even say that.
Yeah, I had a hard time if you didn't hear.
I couldn't spell it, and I taught that class when I was there.
But one of the things we learned on the first day, it was like the 7 ecological maxims or something like that. But one of them wasn't. You can never just do one thing. It is impossible.
Yeah.
So I think about, again, the guy that's like, I'm going to put out a corn feeder, and I'm going to positively affect my deer hunting, and that's all it's going to do. Impossible. You're going to affect more.
Yeah.
Apparently. 50 acres more, apparently.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is the kind of stuff, though, that people need to know, that we have some data on there, and that data, you need to know about it.
This is stuff that I don't think about on a daily basis. I know there's a lot of people just like me that, let's go put out a deer feeder, give me a deer,
Yeah.
Don't think about all this stuff potentially happening.
Yeah. And I'm even aware of some properties that use it specifically because they know they have too many deer, and they use corn as an effective harvest tool to try to reduce the population by harvesting does over that feeder too. So, it's a complicated subject for sure.
Yeah. I'm learning. My mind's about to explode over here.
Yeah.
Well, wait, there's more.
Oh.
Unfortunately, it's not going to get better. So let's just continue on that, since we're on the predation bit, and that's it's not what people want to hear, but it's all they can hear sometimes. Everybody wants to talk about predators, so we'll stay there for a minute. This next study, it has some silver lining where there's some things that we can glean from it. They're pretty important.
Okay.
So this study was in Texas, and again, we're open book with these things. If you want the study, we'll give it to you, and we're not trying to hide anything. Here it is. So they simulated nests there, and they had that same sort of design where they have a simulated nest near a feeding site and a simulated nest that's not near a feeding site. And they're in Texas, a lot of Texas is in this boom bust rainfall cycle. So you have this, when it doesn't rain, basically there's no vegetation, there's no nesting and brooding cover, and reproduction will be very poor. And Brett told us recently on the episode that's about to air with him, the hens will not even try to nest. They'll just not even do it. So they have some adaptations to even deal with it. But they simulated nests, and because they have that cycle in rain, they were able to do something really interesting that we can glean from that study. So when they simulated a nest during a drought year, those nests 100% failed. Okay,
from predation.
Yeah, 100% predated or scavenged. Something came and ate the eggs they put.
Right.
But either way, none of them made it.
Yeah, 100%. that was on fed and unfed. Okay.
Yeah.
So feeding didn't matter during a drought year.
Feeding had no different. It didn't matter where you put the nest; they all failed.
Right.
100%.
Following.
Yeah.
So then they have the fed and unfed in that poor rainfall, and then they got 100 millimeters. Which, how much did we determine that was?
It was between 3 and 4 inches of rain.
So they got 4 inches of rain during that time frame. Yeah. Which to me is like, we got that yesterday.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Different.
So they got 4 inches of rain, and over there, when you get rain, that water is a limiting factor, not sunlight like it is in a lot of the east. Mm-hmm. So what happens is the whole place becomes a foreblend, basically, and you have a whole bunch of good nesting and brooding cover when you get enough rain. And reproductivity on turkeys usually increases substantially. And this well documented patterns in the literature with turkeys. So when we get a little bit of rain, that 4 inches or 5 inches of rain, the fed sites still 100%. None make it, and then we drop down to about 75% for the ones that are not near a feeder. So now we have some cover from all those plants, that have responded to the rain, and it dropped it from 100% from 100% to 75% when there's not a feeder around, but it stayed 100% if there was a feeder nearby.
Yeah. So that's the cool thing you're talking about in regards to this study, Marcus, is that it gives us insights on the effect of feeding as well as how habitat can mitigate nest losses as well.
And that's that's the silver lining that we want to unpack really well. But they had one more step where they got a little more rain. I think it was a little over 5 inches.
About 5 inches, right at 5.
Apparently is enough rain to make the world change over there. So they got a little over 5 inches of rain or so, and then near the feeder dropped down to 80% were lost. So 20% survival or 80% lost.
So you had a lot better cover.
Yeah, near the feeder, and then when it wasn't near a feeder, it dropped down to 40%.
Oh wow,
lost, substantial.
Yes.
So again, you remember what I said earlier? Twofold, same percentages came out here where we have twice as likely to fail when you had really good habitat, twice as likely to fail when you're near the feeder than when you're far. However, the silver lining to that is having really good nesting and brooding cover mitigates some of that effect. But these are simulated nests. I can't state that enough. I just want to make sure that people keep that in mind. But it's enough for me to worry about it.
Right. But even if the good habitat mitigates it, it's still
twofold.
Having a negative impact close to a feeder. When I brought this up, I wasn't even thinking about that.
I knew you would.
It makes my head hurt.
Yeah, and that's only one layer of the onion. We got more layers.
Yeah. But before we move on from that, I think, one other silver lining we can glean from this related to habitat, because, you talked to me and Marcus, and it's always going to get back to that, right?
Right.
Is that this gives us it's an extreme example of showing the relative importance of habitat and mitigating nest predation. It's direct evidence of that.
Right.
But what's so powerful about this is if you look at that change in nest success across that range of habitat conditions, that's a greater effect size, or putting it another way, improvement in nest success than we have seen in any kind of predator control study.
Right.
Even when we exclude them.
Yeah.
Like the predators are excluded, that effect size is so much larger than any of those studies.
Yeah.
So like the habitat is driving it.
Habitat is king, is what you're saying.
And and it has to be. And it's also one of the reasons it has to be is because predation is affected by habitat quality. So
far we've talked about, who uses the feed, right? And it's mostly predators, it's mostly non-targets that we're feeding. And we've talked about how that potentially changes their distribution or their relative abundance in an area and how that affects nest success. But then kind of like the third tier of potential negative effects of feeding on turkeys is the aflatoxin that particularly, grains are capable of producing, and specifically corn. And there was a Mississippi State study that was recently completed that y'all are probably familiar with.
Yeah. Read it.
And they specifically were looking at different types of feeding practices, spin feeders, trough feeders, bait piles on the ground, and the relative levels of aflatoxin present in each of those during different times of the year. So they only looked at it from May through June. So this was, they started kind of towards the end of the nesting period. But I still think it has a lot of carryover to turkeys because, you think about newly hatched poults, they're not eating grain. Mm-hmm. They're not eating grain until they get a little bit bigger. They're just focused on insects initially. Mm-hmm. But they found that after 4 days, the average bait pile during summer exceeded the level that is toxic to birds, and that's greater than or equal to 200 parts per billion. And at that level,
4 days.
Yeah, after 4 days, the average bait. That's not saying all bait piles had that level, but on average, they exceeded that value.
However, and I know you're going to it.
Yeah.
Once you got to 8 days, it was 100% of the bait piles during the summer.
Right.
So it was everyone.
I may have asked y'all this before. Is aflatoxins and aspergillosis, are those two related?
Yes.
Okay.
Aspergillus produces a toxin that's called aflatoxin.
Okay. Yeah.
Because
the aspergillus is the organism.
Okay.
So
we had a wildlife diseases class, and we learned about in a feed lot, there was some corn that sat in a puddle of water, and a bunch of ducks ate it, and they died. Mm-hmm. I remember that was in Dr. Damaris' class.
Yep.
Yeah.
So that one's been particularly important because we have corn agriculture all over the world.
Right.
And there are a lot of people that are working on trying to figure out how to reduce that problem with corn because we have to grow corn for us. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of work being done on aflatoxin.
Yeah.
For human consumption purposes.
Yeah.
So after 4 days, the average bait pile exceeded 200 parts per billion. After 8 days, they all did. And the significance of that threshold is that it's been documented in birds that beyond that level, you have decreased weight, damaged livers, and increased mortality.
That's specifically in wild turkey.
Okay, it wasn't across avian species. That was specific. That was from the Wild Turkey Challenge feeding study.
They fed turkeys that, and those were the results. And there are some other studies, and we don't have them listed on here, that have done some similar types of things.
Right.
And this is just corn that produces this?
Yes, corn that has the aflatoxin associated with it at levels that we've documented in the Mississippi study are occurring in corn that has been there. Well, on average, the corn piles have that by 4 days, and all of them have it by the time you get to 8
during
days.
Summer.
During the summer months. Yeah. May through, you said it earlier.
So just from what I'm gathering, is it like similar to like some kind of mold or something?
Yes.
Yep. Is that something to do with our humidity?
Well, yeah. I mean, that's why it's more prevalent during the summertime.
Right.
Okay. So they found
it's hot and humid.
Yeah. To be clear, during fall and winter, those aflatoxin rates were much lower.
Okay.
Yeah.
Below that toxic threshold for the most part.
And they didn't have it during the spring. And the aspergillus has a range of temperatures and moisture that it needs to do well in. And I can't remember exactly what that is, and we were going to look it up, and we didn't.
But taking that a little bit further, we don't have direct data related to wild turkeys on it, but it has been documented that for northern cardinals, they've shown a decreased immune function with a single dose of aflatoxin at 25 parts per billion. So we were talking about in summertime after 4 days, your average bait pile is going to have over 200 parts per billion, but they've showed...
Yeah, in fact, it was over 1,000. It was thousands, remember?
Yeah.
Yeah, I told you that.
Yeah, it eventually got up to that level.
So let's say those numbers again. Mm-hmm. A few people have gotten to us and it's like, man, you gotta get off these numbers, but this is pretty important.
Yeah.
That study with the Cardinals, they challenged the Cardinal one time with 25 parts per billion, and we have from that Mississippi study they had 100% of the bait piles in the thousands of parts per billion.
Mm-hmm.
We're way over that problem.
They definitely are getting juiced.
What problem? All right, so if a turkey consumes that, what problem does that cause? Like increased mortality rate? Like is that gonna affect their ability to reproduce? Is that gonna?
We don't have it in the wild turkeys. We don't have that data on them.
Okay. Yeah, but so that's one thing we want to make clear is when we're speculating versus when we're going off hard data.
Gotcha.
And we're getting into the land of speculation here, but it's logical speculation.
It was wild turkeys that were challenged, but they were doing it in a facility and challenged, like they were just giving them.
Gotcha.
The corn that had different levels of it and seeing, basically what the
effects were.
Yeah, what the effects were.
But
they were wild turkeys, but they were in a confined thing.
Right.
But the fact that it's been demonstrated for another avian species that a much lower dose can affect immune functioning is obviously cause for concern, because even if a turkey is exposed to a lower rate, it may have these sub-lethal effects like affecting immune function. And when you combine that with the fact that, we're aware of this increased prevalence and distribution of new turkey diseases across the landscape, like LPDV being one of those, I mean, you put two and two together and it becomes worried. Yeah. So in that case, the corn may not be the direct cause of mortality, but it may slow the turkey down enough or decrease its immune function to the point that it becomes more susceptible to that.
Yeah. So potentially you're just making – they eat this stuff, it makes them less fit to survive.
Essentially.
Could.
Yeah.
It's the challenge studies don't look good.
Mm-hmm.
So, again, we don't have that smoking gun. Like, we're not finding dead turkeys around feeders out in the wild. Like, let's be very clear about that. But in an experimental, thing where we try to learn this kind of stuff, we do those kinds of experiments to learn what's the potential things to worry about and look for in nature. It doesn't look good.
But one thing that I spoke to Marcus about earlier that I did want to make clear is when I have made, I have released information related to this on turkeys before, or any species for that matter, I get a lot of guys from Texas where this is a very widely used and accepted practice. I mean, It's part of their culture down there.
Right.
That, we put tons and tons of corn across the landscape and we've got piles of turkeys, especially like in Rio range.
Right.
And I think that that's important to establish a context here that, maybe they're in that semi-arid environment that's not as conducive to aflatoxin growth. And so it's kind of a different context.
Yeah, that's it. And
it hasn't been tested there to my knowledge.
Well, I think there has been a little bit of work there. We don't have it in front of us, but I do recall seeing some stuff from there. So we recently had another guest on our podcast, Dwayne Elmore, and he was talking about some work in Oklahoma that he was part of, and they found unsafe levels of aflatoxins associated with their feeds there too. Mm-hmm. So one thing that he noted in that episode was they actually designed it, a really well designed experiment from what it sounded like. They looked at different feed types and they compared milo to corn, and statistically speaking, the deer use didn't change. So if you fed them milo or corn, they ate it the same amount. But raccoon use of the milo was far suppressed on the milo.
Okay. So it could serve as a viable alternative.
Right. So if you must feed, that will be one way to try to help with some of these issues. The raccoon use is suppressed by switching to milo. And the other important thing what links into this part of our podcast is the aspergillus does not perform nearly as well and as quickly. It can still grow aspergillus and produce aflatoxin, but it does not happen nearly as fast or to the same degree. So the milo is a safer option just in general, and you can potentially decrease the non-target use, especially of raccoon.
Yeah.
So yeah, important stuff.
So maybe whatever that mechanism is that increases predation rates on simulated nests around feeders, whatever that mechanism actually is, you're taking that out of the equation by switching to Milo, because you're not supplemental feeding the nest predators to the same extent, so
right.
you're not potentially boosting their survival and reproduction, or just because their use rates are lower, you're not concentrating the ones that already exist out there around the feeder.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a little bit better. I'm still kind of depressed. It's worrisome, man.
It's not a good story.
Well, and this is, everybody's going to be like, we're going to become a target about this, and I know that, but like, we have enough data to know that we need to worry about this, and we need to figure out what to do about it.
Yeah.
Is it like, we got to figure out, is it a problem, to what degree, and what do we need to do about it?
Mm-hmm.
And there's probably a bunch of people out there mad right now. It's like, well, obviously we need to get rid of it, and then there's the other ones, obviously we need to trap all the coons, and then, I mean, we need to pay attention to it.
The way, this is the way I think of like presenting this information, because there's no way around it. This is a very volatile subject to talk about, but I think about the guy, like I said, probably the vast majority of the type of person that would listen to this. Mm-hmm. Some of these guys may be doing extensive work on their properties, maybe doing some habitat work, but it's mixed in with supplemental feeding. Mm-hmm. And while they're doing everything they can, it's on a very basic comparison. It's like your buddy. It's like if your buddy's about to go out on a date and he's about to walk out the house and you realize he's got something green in his teeth, are you gonna let him walk out the door? Or are you gonna say, "Hey man, I'm just trying to help"? Mm-hmm. You might want to get that out of your teeth.
He done took a bath, put on cologne too, but he still got that green.
So it's like, hey, you're doing incredible.
It's gonna be a little thorn in your side.
So it's like, hey, you're doing all this stuff to try to help your turkey population. I'm just saying that corn free you got out there may be doing harm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And let's look at that. I'm not like, no one in here is trying to point a finger at anybody.
We all want more turkeys.
Yeah.
No, that's one thing I think anybody will never disagree about that's listening to this.
Yeah.
We all want more game to hunt.
Right.
Yeah.
And how are we going to get there?
Yeah.
You know?
And this is, again, this is one of those issues because of the controversy and everything, and the interest group, different interests in it and everything, that's really hard to talk about, and it's kind of being avoided.
Yeah.
And, we're just trying to, I think that we have tried to cultivate trust with the audience to know we're just trying to give you data. This is the data that we have. Mm-hmm. And there's reason for us to be concerned about this and look at it more and think about that and, the implications of what we're doing, because we have certainly changed on the landscape level across a lot of the South, at least, on this particular aspect, and it's just not discussed. I've never heard anyone discuss any of those studies before.
No.
On this, and we're not even done.
Yeah, I didn't.
We still got a lot more.
Yeah.
I don't know how far we are into it, but we got some more stuff.
We can go as much. Jordan, you want to keep talking?
No, I'm here for the party.
Yeah, no, because we have yet to, and it might, like, what the reason why I thought of this in the first place may even be a non-factor. I don't know, but the two things y'all have listed off so far, that wasn't even a thought.
Mm-hmm. So where does your mind go initially when you think about this in the context of turkeys?
I just said I wasn't pointing fingers at anybody, but okay.
Why are you pointing at me?
We're in too deep already to back out now.
And honestly, if y'all tell me that like that's a non-factor, then I'll be like, okay, good. It'd be a relief.
Thank you.
I know for a fact there are turkeys getting harvested, shot, killed, whatever you want to call them, because feeders are influencing that. In states where where the law about that is either a gray area or it's straight up, you're not supposed to shoot turkeys over bait. And I'm not saying turkeys are getting shot under feeders. I'm saying that the feeders are heavily manipulating their movement, and that is causing them to get shot. Like, I don't know how many.
They're getting patterned.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Opening day turkey type deals are like, you ain't getting shot at the feeder, but he's getting shot at the logging road that goes to that food plot where the feeder is. And he ain't coming down that logging road because he heard some good yelping. That's where my head went. Please tell me it's a non-factor. I'll feel better about it.
They're smart.
No, there's okay.
I don't know that we have any data on it.
No.
Okay, good.
It would
There
be,
may be
it would
some,
be
but-
pure speculation on our part.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Is that a reasonable hypothesis? I sure think it is.
It'd be an easy one to test.
Well, there we go. We got a project.
See?
Pull out your wallets.
I don't think that we're going to have many folks wanting to donate funding for us to do that one.
Yeah.
That's my guess. We're probably never going to get another donation after this, but we're going to go on with it.
I think you will. I'm serious. Look. Do I think that this subject is going to step on some toes? Yes, I do.
Mm-hmm.
Do I think it's probably going to make some people mad? Yes, I do. However,
It's also going to make a lot of people think.
I've said this.
Yeah.
I've said this before. I say it again. I do. I have faith in the overall hunting community, and especially in the turkey hunting community. And whether I think there is a chance that some of these guys will hear that and they'll go, "Gosh, dang it! Maybe I need to rethink my faith." I think it's going to be a more positive response. I have faith in our group of hunters.
Well, I've said it a bunch of times, and I'll say it again, that we're concerned about turkeys, and I have been so inspired by the turkey community, and that's including the industry, the researchers, the biologists, the hunters. People have come together over this to try to figure out. I mean, there's argument over what the right step is. But people have come together like I've never seen with anything else ever.
It's been a
my
movement.
Career. I'm so inspired by that, and I'm so appreciative, and I've had so much support up until this launched, and you guys just, I guess all that support probably, some of that's going to go away, but we're just trying to be honest. Our role as scientists, Will and I say this a lot, our role is to try to play, we're trying to play this role where we deliver you data. Like, this is data that's been collected, is published in peer-reviewed journals. We'll give you all of them. That's fine. It's not exhaustive. We got a lot more data on it, and one of the things I wanted to cover is a big overview paper where they collected 115 studies in 35 countries representing 68 species. Pretty big study.
Right.
They collected all this information, so like we're trying. I can't go through all that on a podcast.
Yeah.
But they kind of summarize some findings from that big literature review that actually I don't even know that they include any of the studies we've already talked about, so it's on other stuff. But they were trying to figure out what the wildlife health implications are of supplemental feeding just in general. And that could be in any form. I'm not talking about protein pellets in a feeder necessarily, but those studies are included. And so are bird feeders probably, and all kinds of things. In other words, there's a lot of data out there on a bunch of species in many different kinds of contexts. Unfortunately, we don't have some of the same kind of smoking gun type thing with turkeys, but we're trying to present you what evidence we have from these different systems that we think might be relevant, that we need to be thinking about as people who all want to make sure that we conserve turkeys into the future. About half of the studies, so it's 46% of the studies, were in North America. The first thing, and this is another part we haven't even talked about here, supplemental feeding tended to increase, I'm reading it verbatim, supplemental feeding tended to increase the risk of pathogen transmission by increasing contact rates between hosts. It was 95% of the studies.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
Now you've got feed affecting predation rates potentially, feed producing toxins,
reducing immune function,
and then
to ward off pathogens,
and then feed increasing disease transmission rates.
Yes. It also tended to promote pathogen accumulation at feeders or the surrounding environment. That was 77%. So in other words, some pathogens can sit there, not even associated with an animal, and they're concentrated near those places in those studies. So this is obviously painting with a really broad brush and taking a zoom out, but there's reason to be concerned. Yeah, I was a part of one study. So we're talking about pathogens. Most people are probably thinking about a virus or something, but I was part of one study on raccoons, where we had raccoons that were given to us, where we could kind of dissect them and see what was inside of them, from properties that had feeding, like corn feeders on it, versus properties that didn't. And this was in Mississippi as well. And the pathogen or the parasite loads of the raccoons from the fed sites was higher. So we published that paper as well from Mississippi. But so pathogens could include a virus or bacterial thing, or it could be
any
parasites.
one of a number of parasites.
Yeah. So
essentially, just making like a little hot zone.
It's like a little petri dish.
Yeah.
Just at every corn feeder.
Yeah.
The provision food, they said it was also a source of immunosuppressive contaminants, which would include the aflatoxins. That's what that means, suppressing immune function. It was associated with increased wildlife stress, rates of injury, pathogen prevalence, and malnutrition.
Stress and wildlife injury. What does it equate to?
Like they got injured for some reason associated with it, and I don't know.
I gotcha.
The thing that struck me out of that is one of the things that they listed was malnutrition.
Yeah.
So becoming
feeding wildlife, and they become malnutritioned as a result of it.
Is it because they become too dependent on that?
Well, it's one of those things that, and I think it's kind of intuitive. Like like my youngin', she wants to eat nothing but candy and ice cream.
Gotcha.
And I don't want her to eat only that, but she would do that. And if she did do that, and I allowed that, she could probably get malnutrition.
Yeah. So we're just feeding them this one source, and they're not getting everything they need.
There's also a chance with certain grain feeds we know in wildlife that if animals consume too much of it, it changes the composition of the bacteria in their digestive system, which in turn affects their ability to digest certain foods. So it could be that overconsumption is leading to that microbial change, and thus they can't extract as much nutrients from food as they normally would. They probably don't have as diverse of a diet as they would in the absence of that supplemental food source too. And that's how it could affect their performance.
This is loaded. There is a lot of layers.
Yeah.
This thing just keeps snowballing.
But I think one thing that's important to talk about is, given everything that we just covered, if you are going to feed, what are some of the ways that you could potentially mitigate that risk?
Yeah.
And the most immediate, obvious one that comes to mind for me, especially as it pertains to the aflatoxin and the nest predation risk, is avoid feeding during nesting season and avoid feeding during summer when you've got that greater probability of the aflatoxin forming at higher concentrations that are toxic.
Yeah.
That brings me to another question. You just mentioned try to avoid feeding during nesting season. So let's say you have a feeder going all deer season. You attract all these nest predators. They call that home now because that's where the buffet is. When that buffet stops, do they disperse back to normal, or do they stay?
We don't know. We don't know.
Well, and so we don't know if new individuals come in and take up shop.
There's a lot to it. Yeah.
But in terms, what I suspect would happen if, let's say, we're in the home range of a raccoon and you put a food source in it, it's going to get really concentrated in its activity around that food source, and I suspect if you removed it, it'd probably reduce that concentration again.
But the question is, in the meantime, did you increase the litter size and the survival of the offspring so that you've inflated the density, and that's going to have a carryover effect.
Yeah.
And we don't
just
have
don't
that
know.
data on
Even
that.
if you cut it off, there's still more out
Man,
there.
it's a lot to think about on this.
And we
it really is.
don't know.
Right.
I'm
You
processing.
guys wanted us to unpack it.
I like
I
it.
do want, yeah.
So here it is.
And Marcus, correct me if I'm wrong, because you're more familiar with that the Wang study than I am, the one that was in Mississippi with the aflatoxin. But I'm pretty sure that I recall from that study that they found that just piles of corn on the ground were the worst in terms of aflatoxin concentrations, whereas spin type feeders were associated with lower rates. So that's another way that people could potentially mitigate this risk.
But I mean, think what is promoting the growth of the organism. One is this really high quality food source, which corn is as good as it gets. 2 is the humidity, and 3 is the temperature. So think about that. Even when you're holding all of that food in a feeder, that.
I mean, obviously,
that's not going to be a
it can
dry,
get
cool,
moisture in there. It's got a
not
hole
going
in
to
it.
be a dry, cool place in the South generally.
Yeah.
And feeders, even a spin cast, I mean, during the hotter months, it turns this 30, 40, 50 degrees hotter inside that plastic feeder than it would be outside.
Which, I can't remember the range of temperatures that the organism grows in, but it could even be that if it gets too hot for it. I don't know what that is, so I can't speak to it, but I'm just trying to get you to think about all the different aspects to this, because it seemed like this is going to be something pretty easy.
Yeah.
And then we were like, well, we're going to have to take notes and do some homework right here and really study on this to make sure that we present this as objectively as we can based on information. And this is not all the data out there. Just we're trying to build an objective storyline that's understandable, to understand this is complex and it's something we need to be looking at.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. My eyes have been opened.
Is there, do you know if there's any planned research to look into this more, or is it still just kind of, is anybody looking into this besides y'all? I guess.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because what I've just heard, and are there more layers in the onion to look at today?
Well, one of the ones that I've been particularly interested in is that question that I brought up just a minute ago, is whether or not it's potentially supplementing nest predator populations in the sense that it's improving their reproductive rates.
Right.
And so that's a study that I've had in mind to do for a while. I actually presented that one to Turkeys for Tomorrow a while back, and they were very interested in it, but there were some other things that were higher priority at the time. So that's something that may be an eventual reality.
Right.
Well, and, we need to I think there's enough interest with turkeys that this is something that should be on the minds of people that do this kind of work and thinking about it. And I'll be speaking out of turn if I told you there was data, or there were people that were going to work on it. But I seem to remember that didn't Dwayne or Coulter, one of them said, I thought, that they might do some work related to feeders.
I don't recall.
So I think there are a couple of other researchers. I don't have any ongoing research anymore. That I do have some from the Mississippi study that we haven't gotten published yet. We didn't even cover that.
Y'all are going to dissect this even more on your podcast per week, huh? It's going to be several series.
Yes.
Several
and we have
episodes.
lots of scientists that we're going to try to get on
Yeah,
there.
so, I mean,
they're looking at this from different perspectives, and there may even be data to suggest in some contexts this, some of these things aren't a problem, and we're going to try to find those people that are doing that work. If we can find it, we're going to cover it.
Right.
Because we want you to have the full story. That's the thing, is you need to see the whole context, and it's hard, to give you the whole context. And there's probably studies out there that suggest some of these things aren't a big problem in some contexts. And then we've covered several of them that make me worry for sure. Just I'll just speak in generalities. One of the student that I had working on the feeder project, we were looking at a few things of interest. One, everybody knows if you put a feeder out, you get all that activity around it. You end up, especially if it's wet, you get a big mud hole around you got all this open ground around it. And we wanted to look at a few things. One, if we're concentrating all the deer use right there and all the feeding activity, how's that affecting the plant community? Well, we know for one thing, it's really increasing the amount of bare ground. So we had another part of that same study where we were tracking seed dispersal. So there's seeds in the feeder, right? So things that come to eat seeds in that feeder also eat seeds that are not in the feeder from the environment. Mm-hmm. And you can imagine if you concentrate all the activity near a feeder, all of a sudden you kind of become this vacuum for seeds in a place where you've cleared all the vegetation. So we were basically looking at what's getting directed there, and then if you move the feeder, what colonizes all that open
It's
ground
just like
right
preparing
there.
a seed bed to plant for a food plot. I mean, that's exactly what you do. You clear all the other vegetation, you disturb the soil, you add seed, and you add water. You know, it's the optimum conditions for plant growth. Yeah.
So we have to revisit the sites to get what actually colonized, but we do know what came to it in terms of seeds. Mm-hmm. And the amount of seed, we call it seed rain. So just think about like how hard is it raining? Rains much harder near the feeder than it does far from feeders.
Right.
And there were some species are undesirable, like problematic species.
Yeah.
A lot of them are dispersed by animals.
And under normal conditions, that would be dispersed over a broader landscape, right?
Yeah, they might be dispersed over a broader landscape, and they're certainly usually not going to be concentrated in areas that are really easy to colonize.
Right.
A receptive seed bed.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay, that's another interesting thing.
Right. So we don't, it could create a situation where we could bred particular types of plants. We don't have the data fully done yet to figure that out, but another layer of the onion, right, that we need to understand and think about. And we did not find a really big effect of the herbivory. Mm-hmm. So all the deer feeding on the plants around it, there's been inconsistent results on that across studies as well. Mm-hmm. But you still could have long-term effects on the vegetation because of that, the input of new seeds into that seed bank.
Potentially negatively affecting your habitat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's a lot of things going on. You're just like you said, you're not doing just one thing.
You can never just do one thing.
You're affecting a lot of different things. And, we don't really have a very good handle on movement. And, a lot of these things we don't have data on the wild birds, and like with turkeys, like what are they doing related to feeders. But I certainly know, and everybody out there knows that they'll come to feed. Yeah. So,
one of the other things that we didn't even talk about today is whether or not these feed sites turn into ambush sites, even for adult turkeys. Mm-hmm. Is it possible that like bobcats and coyotes in particular have a learned behavior?
I've seen some pictures.
You would think they'd have to be. I mean, you would a predator being opportunistic. Mm-hmm. You would think they would have to be.
Yeah. Yeah. When I heard Dana Morin was on Gamekeepers the other day, mm-hmm. and she's a predator specialist, mm-hmm. movement specialist, and they asked her a similar question to that, and I believe she responded very similar that we won't have very strong data, but like a coyote, if they figure out a place where they can get an easy meal, she said something along the lines she can't imagine that they would not exploit that opportunity.
Right.
So I don't know, but
out of all the different effects, like I said, there's a lot that we know about, some we don't know. Can y'all think of just in terms of wild turkeys? Out of all these effects, can you think of any positive ones tied to supplemental feeding corn during the springtime, during nesting? Can you think of any positive effect?
Not off the top of my head.
I think our silence is an answer in itself.
Well,
I mean, seriously, think about that.
Yeah, and to be transparent about it, these things that we were laying out, that it's not necessarily a certainty that they all are at play all the time in every place.
Right.
This is context dependent stuff, and there may be areas where some of these things, like we talked about with Texas with the aspergillus, probably not an issue there. This is just something that we need to be looking at and be worried about it, and especially with the eastern populations where we're particularly worried about populations. Some of those things could be real threats that we need to understand.
Yeah.
And they may not be an issue, but I would like to know that.
Yeah.
So before everybody starts throwing rocks at us, your context, it may not be an issue, but we know enough that we know that we should be thinking about this. The other thing in terms of the positives, we're going to cover this on our episodes, but I can't remember. There may have been one supplemental feeding study from Texas that showed a positive effect on survival or something.
Gotcha.
And I don't remember what it was now, but there is one on turkeys, and I just can't remember. But I do remember that I think it showed either a statistically significant positive or it trended positive at least. And there's probably some stuff that's neutral.
Right.
Like, we were trying to lay out that we do have evidence of things you could be concerned about, but in some contexts, some of those things might be neutral or even in some cases we could see a positive, but those cases are pretty rare.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
My biggest takeaway from this is I feel like this needs to be looked into more. I feel like there's a lot of, like a term you said, there's a lot of things that are just striking, make you raise your eyebrow and go, we need to find out about this.
The controlled nest predation is what really has blown my mind about this.
Yeah.
Like, under those conditions, feed versus no feed.
Yeah.
That's what really has opened my eyes today.
Yeah.
Well, we talked a lot about the weaknesses of those studies, but we didn't talk about the strength of them, which, we have a replicated, very well-designed experiment where we have fairly well isolated feeding as a mechanism.
Yeah.
And that is a tall order to do with a wild turkey. So, simulating the nest, while it has weaknesses, there also is the strength that you can design a really well-designed experiment that's basically impossible in nature to do with a real animal in many cases. Anyway.
Right. Yep. Well, I imagine I'll have to listen to this over again.
And this has not been a fun conversation, but it has been an informative one.
No, that's what
it's not going to be fun to get all this. Catch all this heat we're about to get.
Well, and also,
but we got to be honest.
Yeah,
we gotta try to do whatever we can to have it for generations past us. And with that being said, y'all are going to be airing more into this, going just dissecting it layer by layer. And when is that going to be coming out?
Not sure yet.
Okay, later in the spring, right?
Yeah. We have one episode that we already we talked to Dwayne Elmore, so if you want to listen to it, it's the episode we have Dwayne Elmore with, and he talked a little bit about the Oklahoma stuff that we mentioned on here. And then I'm not sure what the timeline will look like, but it's coming.
Yeah,
right.
And some of it will depend on how people, if we get a big response from people and they need to hear that, then we'll make it happen.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like we'll expedite topics that are of very high interest because we want to respond to what the people's needs are, and that's why we're doing this.
I would have to imagine this was probably going to get a pretty sizable response, but
yeah,
I remain with what I said. I have faith in our community And I think the response is going to be more of like, please tell me more about this.
Yeah.
That's what I'm hoping. Whenever y'all do come out with that, we'll do everything we can on our end through Primos and Onyx to usher people to that information, because it's information. Because like if we all can agree, all of us in this room and everyone listening to it, we're all on the side of wild turkeys, and whether or not it's information you want to hear or information that's tough to hear.
Yeah,
it's got to be heard.
And some folks out there, if you like to read peer-reviewed literature, we're happy to send it. But if you also know of literature that that you would like us to cover in detail, send it to us, because I think we've kind of established that by now in our podcast. We are giving you the different points of view that we can capture from different people. And we're trying to do that and trying to give you the whole story and why there's maybe confusion or disagreement or whatever, even among the scientists. So if you have something that you want us to cover, then we will. There's one big issue that I'm guessing is going to come up. I don't really want to say it just to see if it does, but we've been getting a bunch of questions about another aspect of this and how much data we have on it, and we've dug around a little bit on that aspect as well, and we're going to cover that in detail.
Gotcha.
So we're getting questions on it, but I don't want us to end up on
just blow the lid off that one yet.
We don't need another 45 minutes.
Yeah. No,
I've enjoyed it, and you educated me on some things, and that's a good thing. So.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I mean, I definitely I'll leave this conversation with more worries, but I also leave it with more answers.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
And should you be concerned? I think that the answer to that is yes. To what degree and when, that's where we need to go with it and figure it out.
That needs to be found out. Jordan, you have anything to add? Any more questions?
Nope. I'm going.
You don't want to know anymore?
I'm finna go eat.
You going to go eat some corn?
I don't want
corn dog.
Yeah. Well, gentlemen, I appreciate it.
Yes, sir. Good to be here with you.
Yeah, likewise.
Not a fun conversation, but one that needed to happen.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just like, I'm not even my normal self about it,
Yeah. It was so I guess if y'all have made it to this point in the episode, if y'all didn't get upset and turn it off, if you made it to this point, this episode came about. We had finished recording the episode we just released a week or two ago, and we were just shooting the breeze, and this subject came up, and y'all started talking. I said, whoa. This just needs to be a whole thing. So I'm glad that we did it. And, please keep us in the loop when that series comes out, because I know myself and Jordan will be very intent on listening to it. And then I knew people were in tune with wanting to know more about turkey science. I was blown away. The episode we released last time, I had a significant number of people. How do I read these studies that you're talking about? Which I'll do a good job of putting them on your show page where you can find them. But people are into this stuff, man. They want to know. They want answers, and that's what we're trying to help with. Yeah. I mean, where can I find the studies? I'm like, you want to read the study? Like it's just a guy from But we try our best to help where we can.
Well, I think the scientific community is getting aware that there are a lot of people out there like that. I've been surprised by it the same way, but we've got multiple folks in the wild turkey world that are making efforts to get data, these data-driven things, the peer-reviewed manuscripts that we've published on these topics in places where you can get them. And when I mean you, I mean anyone out there that wants to read it. And we've all been making concerted efforts in different ways to try to make it accessible to you, and then have these kinds of discussions so that you can understand the full context if we can give it to you. And then sometimes we miss the context and everybody tells us about it, and then we do another one.
Yeah. Guys, thank you. We'll wrap this up. Didn't enjoy the conversation.
It's normally fun, but this
one was not. But it was important, like I said. But yeah, keep us in the loop. And as always, guys, if you have any questions, feel free to send them in. And thank you so much for listening to the Speak the Language podcast presented by Onyx Hunt.